think we'll make a start now because we don't have a huge amount of time. Welcome to this policy exchange and home group fringe. Thank you so much for coming to hear us discuss the future of housing. I'm Isabel Hardman. I work for the Spectator and the Telegraph, and I'll be chairing today's event. We're joined by a great panel. On my left is Jack Dromey, the Shadow Minister for Housing, who's been a Labour MP since 2010. We've got Mark Henderson next to me, who's Chief Executive of Home Group, who are also kindly sponsoring this event. Mark is also Vice Chair of Business and Enterprise UK and Chairman of Young Enterprise North East. On my other side is Grainia, who's Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Housing and was previously Chief Executive of CIH in Northern Ireland. And Alex Morton at the end is Head of Housing and Planning at Policy Exchange. So we're going to have a slightly different format for this event because Jack has to disappear to another one of his 55 fringes that he's doing today. So he's going to speak, and then Mark is going to speak. Then we'll take a few questions from the floor, and then we'll hear from Grainia and Alex after that. So Jack, do you want to kick off for us?
Fine. Thank you very much, Isabel. And can I start by making the point I was making just now, that the single biggest thing in terms of the announcement today is that we're talking about a scale of ambition which will go from the lowest level of house building since the 1920s at the start of the decade to at the end of the decade having doubled house building. It will be a formidable enterprise, but we will deliver. We won't stop there either, because such is the scale of the housing crisis on the one hand and the backlog on the other hand. What we need is a 2 to 5 and 5 to 10 year perspective, and then ultimately we will be building for a generation. Now, particular focus today on social housing. I grew up at a time when politicians vied with one another as to who could build the most council homes. I remember it well. I remember it was to get on the council. I told a story the other night about Rosalind Lynch at my primary school, who came in one day and proudly announced that they'd got on the council. And about half an hour later, she told me that her mother had now become middle class. I said, why? She said, because she'd got a clerical job. But I also then saw, as secretary of the Brent Federation of Tenants and Residents Associations, as I think you all know, I was a union man, but I was also secretary of the Brent Federation. Both the strengths of that social housing tradition, but also, I have to say, the need and the weaknesses of it. If whoever designed the Stonebridge Park estate clearly never intended to live in it themselves. Now, if I can then come up to date, to be frank, I was one of those that was critical of our government when we were in power on council housing. Social housing more than just council housing, but on council housing. I think it was wrong to allow new build council housing to reduce to 300 in the whole of England in 1 year, but 9 years ago. I understand the priority that was given at the time to the Decent Homes programme, 1.6 million homes that were renovated, and I've seen firsthand the immense benefits that accrued from that, including in tenants in the constituency in which I live. But having said that, it was wrong, and now there is a chronic need, and we are going to meet that need. As part of that ambitious building programme over the next 10 and 15 years, it will of course be homes of all tenures. To buy, market rent, the new generation of social homes, talking about it just now about custom build, self-build, cooperative development, a whole range of contributions towards solving that housing crisis. But we're focusing today on that new generation of council homes, of social homes. Now, if we were wrong to preside over a rapid decline of council house building, we were right to open up the opportunity for councils with HRA reform. What we're now seeing as a consequence is councils building all over the country, Labour councils building 5 times more council homes than Conservative councils, and Southwark being the particular shining beacon, building 20,000 homes. We will be carrying forward that development in government. We will commit on grant and investment, number one, and number two, we are very sympathetic to the proposal that's come to us, I have to say, from councillors of all political parties, that the remaining constraints upon local authorities to be able to borrow against their assets and income stream should be taken away so that they can invest to build. Now, in parallel, I want to say something very briefly about the housing associations before I come on to doing, as I say to Isabel on the lift and the way up, I'm going to do, in fact, we're doing it at all the meetings, that which David Cameron never does, which is to answer the questions. The questions have been posed in advance, and I'm going to respond to those questions. I just want to say one thing in relation to the housing associations, is that they are a key provider of social housing. But we are strongly supportive, indeed we've been talking about this over the last 36 hours, of the direction of travel of housing associations in terms of developing a wider portfolio of approach for the future. And that's not just the exigencies of the time that's driven that kind of modelling because of the uncertainties post-2015. It is also, in my view, a thoroughly good thing that the Housing Association of 2020 builds homes of all tenures because they're uniquely placed to build such homes in mixed communities. And then one final thing that brings together the housing associations and the local authorities. My very strong view is that the key engine of delivery of a major uplift in supply will be the housing associations and the councils working together. Of course, in turn, working with builders and developers, homes of all tenure. But I know from my experience thus far, where you get that kind of dynamic partnership at local level, it adds immense value in terms of your capacity to build, but also on a wider sense, the excellent work that gets done by housing associations on health and social care and worklessness combined with what some of the best of local authorities are doing. So that key engine of delivery, that will be the housing association and the local authorities. Right, the questions, and I shall rattle through them. Who should obtain social housing? Predominantly social housing is for people, to be frank, who cannot afford any other tenure. And ultimately, a needs-based approach will be the main determinant, But can we have an intelligent debate about allocation policies? I think, yes, we can. And indeed, I know that this is happening right now up and down the country. If I can give some examples of that. I mean, historically, do you remember the debate that was going on 15, 20 years ago about key sector workers? But coming up to date, the notion of potentially rewarding community champions, as somebody put it to me the other day, I'm not sure that was the best way of describing it, but also local connections. If I can just give this example, both Islington and Southwark are doing it. In the case of Southwark, with this ambitious programme to build 10,000 council homes, what they're doing is to have an allocations policy, because much of this is in areas where already there's high density council housing, whereby 50% of the homes allocated will go to local people from that area, people with local roots. And I must say, in terms of winning consent for development, I think what our experience tells us is the more that you can convince people that there is something in it for them, including for their sons and daughters, the more likely you are to get consent to development. So, of course, for people who cannot afford other tenures, of course, but in addition, a sensible approach towards allocations, a sometimes difficult debate about how you weigh in the balance these different factors. But the idea that it should be simply needs-based, I don't agree with that. Now, the next question is, what will happen to the affordable rent model? We are certainly not going to stick lock, stock and barrel with what the government have currently put in place. The affordable rent model, amongst other things, drives up housing benefit bills. I mean, when they did their own modelling, when it was introduced, it was £1.8 billion they calculated with extra in terms of housing benefit bills. Over the weekend, as a consequence of Boris seeking to impose on London the affordable rent model, there was that startling letter from Westminster Council to government saying, well, hang on a second, if that was imposed in our borough, you do realise that you have to earn, see if I can get the figures right, £56,000 for a one-bedroom flat and £109,000 for a three-bedroom home. Hands up here, those who believe that that is affordable housing. We are not going to stick with the affordable rent model as it currently stands. Certainly, there should be no question of imposition. Should there be potentially a degree of flexibility? Well, there was under us a degree of flexibility on rents, for example, the intermediate rent model. Can you have a sensible debate of that kind? Yes. Should you do what Boris is doing in London on the one hand, or the government is doing to what are called developing housing associations on the other hand, and say, well, it's that, like it or lump it? Absolutely not. Next question, should we keep subsidised rents for tenants? Yes. We subsidise tenants in the private rented sector by £8.6 billion and rising. And incidentally, the great majority of new applicants are people who are in work. And what's happening increasingly is that we are paying housing benefit to subsidise low wages. But yes, and David Orr has put it, and he's absolutely right, is ultimately you can't have subsidised housing without subsidy. And it would be impossible to build social housing on the scale necessary other than you did have subsidy. So I have no problem about the notion of subsidy. Should we keep expensive social housing in the sector or sell it off? I think this is an area where I think historically, Alex, we may have disagreed, although I must say one of the things about Policy Exchange is they come up with a lot of very thought-provoking ideas, and occasionally we agree with one another. No, I don't agree. I don't agree on a blanket approach. Actually, if you then look at, and I remember when this was first mooted back a year ago plus, it wasn't exactly a scientific study, but the next 5 housing associations in London, there were, and the next 5 councils that I spoke to, I asked every single one of them, what do you do at the moment? And they said, well, the whole time we're making decisions about disposal of stock, including sometimes high-value stock, which we then reinvest elsewhere in the area in which we're serving. How much flexibility should the sector have on key areas of policy? With much greater. I gave the example earlier on about housing associations developing a broader portfolio of approach. I'm totally supportive of that, with one great caveat, which of course you know about, and the Grainia, is that the social mission of the housing association must be preserved. Nearly finished these questions. How much for the sector? Well, I'll tell you what, the final one is being so I can take a couple of questions before I have to go to the next meeting. It says, are there any easy wins that could help build homes in a difficult financial climate? In terms of easy wins, it would be carrying forward HRA reform. That for certain would be an easy win, putting councils on an even footing as housing associations. It is actually what I've said in terms of the dynamic partnership between local authorities and housing associations, but crucially also, it's about the commitment of grant and investment. Allied to what we're going to be doing in terms of tackling a dysfunctional land and building industry, including in turn incentivising those who build and build quickly. Will we be able to solve the housing crisis in 2015, to quote Mrs. Thatcher quoting Tommy Cooper, just like that? No, we won't. It will take time. But are there things that we can do that make a major difference in the first 2 to 5 years? Yes. By the end of the first 5 years, we will have doubled house building, and we will then, excuse the very bad pun, build upon that until we finally overcome Britain's housing crisis.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack. We're now going to take questions just for Jack, and if I could make a plea, I know people at party conferences have wonderful chatter boxes, but if you could keep your questions really, really short, I'm not going to speech, and if you keep going, Jack will probably just leave. So try to keep it really short. We'll take 3 questions.
Yeah, 3.
There's a man in a greyish blue shirt at the back.
Conor McCauley from Union Council. I will keep the right to buy in the current form.
Okay.
And 2 more. We're at the front.
Social rented, really, what's your commitment to social rented housing? We talked about affordable housing not being affordable anymore, 80% market rent. So.
Yep. Okay.
1 more? Alex wants to ask a question.
What are your views of how you think neighbourhood planning will fit and evolve under if Labour return to power, and why the million extra homes why wasn't it 1,150,000? Because the household projections are what 232,000. So that seems it seems odd that it was 1 million homes rather than the household projection figure.
And we'll just take one more question from the floor as well. Yeah, chat there.
With regard to what I've seen is a shortcoming, is delivering value management. Do you think TMOs are sufficiently pragmatic for both ratepayers and leaseholders to be involved in delivering value management?
Okay. Right. First of all, Conor, I've just been with the Mayor of Newham on the excellent work that you've done in relation to the private rented sector. And do you know what? I was writing out the clappers. I forgot to write down your question.
Right to buy, are you going to keep it in its current form?
Right to buy. Well, the straight answer is no, we're not going to repeal right to buy. And let me just tell you a little story. I was one of those back in the 1980s that led the charge against right to buy. We were halfway across the field of battle. We looked over our shoulder and there was no bastard behind us. 1.5 million council tenants bought their homes. And to be frank, we're not going to repeat the mistakes of history because it became a symbol of us being the enemy of aspiration, Mrs. Thatcher being the champion of aspiration. Well, we are the party of aspiration. So never again, never again. Now, can you have a sensible debate about the terms upon which right to buy happens? Well, actually, that's kept under review by successive governments, and successive governments have made changes to that criteria. On the point then about social homes, to be clear about beyond any doubt, we are talking about a new generation of social homes. Built by council and by housing associations. As I said earlier, there'll be a mixed portfolio of approach. Indeed, Newham is talking about building for market rent as part of their approach. But a new generation of social homes is both right in terms of meeting housing needs, but also it is right in terms of not driving up housing benefit bills in the way that the affordable rent model does. Alex, your point about the planning system. I led for us, I'll never forget it, 20 committee stages of the localism bill on planning. We're not going to tear up the National Planning Policy Framework lock, stock and barrel. I think that would be a mistake, it's unnecessary, it would create a damaging hiatus at a time that when we want to get Britain seriously building. Incidentally, it was before Get Britain Building launches thus far. Grant Shapps, do you remember him, the man who gave hubris a bad name? If we'd have had a house for every press statement Grant Shapps issued, we wouldn't have a housing crisis. But we're not going to create a damaging hiatus. Having said that, we are looking at some changes. So first of all, common criteria across local authorities in terms of housing need assessments, because it varies enormously. Secondly, this issue of the right to grow. What do you do about Stevenage unable to build the 16,000 to 18,000 homes it desperately needs so it can succeed and expand because it can't get the cooperation of Hertfordshire under duty to cooperate. In their dreams could they get that cooperation. So there's an issue of that kind. Thirdly, we are looking at, and in fact part of it's all been already rolled out publicly, enhanced powers for local authorities on land, ranging from, on the one hand, use it or lose it. The notion that if you have planning land for development with planning permission, unless there's a reasonable excuse, and incidentally, of course there was in 2008 and 2009 and 2010, but unless there's a reasonable excuse for not building out, you build. And if you don't build, the capacity of local authority to levy charges and ultimately to compulsory purchase. But the other thing that we are determined to do is to give local authorities enhanced powers to acquire land, to build a bank of land for development. I don't want to go into the details of that at this stage. And one final thing about land is that there's also, of course, the issue of public land. Now, local authority land is the single biggest land bank. But there's this issue of government land. I mean, how many times have we heard about we're going to release government land and then bugger all happens? So one of the things that we'll be doing is on a strategic basis across all departments is to drive release of government land. Now, one final thing, partly because I've got to go, unfortunately. So I need to probe the details of what you were saying earlier further. But look, I'd be very happy after this afternoon, or preferably tomorrow, when I've done my last meeting, to have a further discussion with you. Would you grab? Are you at the conference?
I'm just visiting the fringe.
How long are you around?
I'm local, so I live locally.
Right.
I can fix them.
Could you give Alex your contact details? Because I need to probe further details of what you're saying. But I'd be very happy to talk to you. Would you mind giving Alex or one of Alex's team your contact details at the end, and I'll give you a ring next week? Would that be okay?
Great.
Fine, excellent. At that, I've got to get away.
Thank you very much, Jack. Let's give you another round of applause. We'll continue our fringe discussion now, and Mark's going to speak to us now.
Okay, thanks, and thanks, Jack. I appreciate you on round number 15 of 22, I think, isn't it? So we do appreciate you coming along. Thanks for your time. Just wanted to touch on a couple of points today, because I think there's actually some big stuff that's been revealed, and I'm sure we're all going to go and listen to rather eagerly in the next hour or so. But I just want to touch on three things. Firstly, in terms of what's the point of social housing, about it actually meeting a basic need for life. Secondly, the term affordable, that has got mixed up. The question earlier just about, and is affordable definable as one size fits all? What does that actually really mean for people in this country? And that final point I wanted to talk about and touch on is actually how we actually deliver homes. And I think it's great to have targets of numbers, but how are we going to make sure that that's delivered? How are we going to make sure there is that big slug of social housing delivered and guaranteed to be delivered in the right place at the right time in this country? So first of all, in terms of meeting a need, that's very core, I guess, to the purpose of Home Group. Our purpose really started 77 years ago. We were formed one of the few responses from the government at the time to the Jarrow March. So actually, about providing decent and secure and quality accommodation is very kind of core to the purpose of our association. And since those very early days, we've grown to become one of the largest housing associations in the UK. But that core purpose, and Jack talked about this, and others have talked about how important it is to retain that core purpose at the heart and in the soul, indeed, of any housing association going forward. Yes, we will respond to market demand, but we must all keep that core purpose close to our hearts going forwards. Now, in terms of affordability and meeting that need, it's kind of undeniable, isn't it? There is going to be a continued need, and despite a big development programme in this country over the coming years, there are 1.8 million people on the waiting list in this country, and that grows, and that also masks a lot of sofa surfers, a lot of people who would move if the opportunity arose, but are not actually registered to move forwards. And I think there's a number of things we can do about that, but first of all, I think what we need to really counter in this country is to fight back against the demonisation of social housing tenants and people on benefits. I think it's been one of the saddest, most shocking things that I have seen working in the housing world, and just being a member of this country, whereby some parts of the media kind of really try to demonise social housing tenants. And if you look in other countries where it's not actually an offence to be a social housing tenant, in France or in Germany or in Holland and things like that, where that is considered to be something to actually aspire to. We need to get that position back in this country. And at the end of the day, it is not about demonising this cohort of people, because that's a group of people who actually help run our economy. Who is going to fix your car? Who is going to drive the train? Who is going to look after you when you're in hospital? If actually there is no affordable housing in the places where that economy needs that affordable housing, and those key workers and that range of people in the community. So I think it's really, really important, before we take these next steps on building a major programme of social housing, to really campaign against this slow progress of demonisation of our customer base. Now, secondly, I'd like to talk about the issue of affordability. It's been talked about already. I don't think that affordability is a one-size-fits-all issue at all. Of course, we must, as housing associations and providers of social housing, we must make sure that we provide housing for people who are genuinely in need, where there is no alternative. Of course, that is our core purpose. We must always support the vulnerable in this country. But But it's also about having, I think, a range of products targeted for a whole range of different people who cannot afford to move into the housing market in those areas. You just look at in-work poverty, which is currently rising at an incredible rate in this country, and actually starting to force people further and further away from opportunities for employment as well as actual employment. And so in the paper a couple of days ago, we were building near Elephant and Castle, and not actually even in the nicest bit of Elephant and Castle, a starter flat for £375,000. A starter flat for £375,000. Oh my God, that is 1,000 times more than my first house when I was lucky enough to be able to buy it. And I think of my kids. I think when they come out looking for a job, as my son will in London next year, how on earth is he going to be able to afford £70,000 deposit? How on earth is he going to move into a job and earn £65,000 a year and be able to give 40% of that up to pay that mortgage? We need to be able to, we need to be able to provide some sense of affordability for people who are just facing these challenges. The second part, I think, is this definition of affordable. Not only does it price people out, again, we turned down an opportunity to develop or to purchase in part of the southeast, not the richest part of the southeast. 80% of the market rate was £270 a week. And we just declined the opportunity. That's not what we do as an organisation. But somebody had to do that. Somebody went in there, and if you think it was 270, it was 80%, then the market rate is over £300 a week. Again, who is providing a solution for people in that particular situation? And not only that, there's a double impact of this affordable rent, where the shift has gone from actually what is the most value for money means of providing social housing, which is capital grant, into this revenue support. 80% means housing associations have to borrow more and more to provide housing. That pushes our borrowing limits ever further northwards. And there's a point. We can't continue to go on borrowing as housing associations. There's a point. Most of us have kind of a 70% gearing ratio with our lenders, and they will stop us borrowing once we go beyond that. If we continue pursuing one size at only 80%, not only are we actually pricing a lot of people out in terms of affordability, we're actually coming to an inevitable conclusion of social housing funded through the current models. So, we need more homes. I think that's patently obvious in this country. I think Ed had said yesterday, Bowles had said yesterday, no rise in public spending. So how are we going to do that? Three ideas. One is about shift of public funding. And if we look at the NHS, one of the things that makes Britain great, I have to say, and as you can tell, a major beneficiary of the NHS system itself. But how do we shift some of the NHS money, which is spent on dealing with people who are sick, to actually prevent the illness from happening in the first place? And a quality home and quality support in that home is an essential component of that. I think, actually, when you look at the NHS, already has a funding gap of, I think it was £30 billion over the next decade. Actually taking some of a preventative switch can make a big difference to the budget. Secondly, and one thing we'd like to propose, and I know Jack has taken this seriously, is looking at the means of creating a housing investment bank, or perhaps a housing infrastructure bank for this country. State-owned, but run off balance sheet as a commercial entity that can actually raise significant sums of relatively cheap cash and loan that into the social housing sector to provide new finance for new affordable housing. And our third suggestion for governments in the future, looking at some of the lessons and taking lots of the bits that are out there, and we've got kind of initiative-itis of various bits of policy over the past couple of years. How do we actually, without inventing some new stuff, because God, I've got enough new stuff to deal with, how do we bring them all together and make them work in some sense of coherence? We propose creating housing zones, where the government can actually determine where we need the right scale and mass. So I'm talking about delivering these 200,000 new homes, not 30 here and 30 there. How can we actually create a vehicle and a means to get the right number of houses in the right places without falling foul of boundaries and squabbles between local authorities and where housing should be placed, and make sure that particularly social housing is placed next to centres of employment growth, so we can actually grow more prospects for our communities and our customers going forwards. And I think we can put together a range of incentives in there. I agree absolutely with Jack in terms of enhancing CPO powers for local authorities. I'd even go further and say we should give local authorities CPO powers that they can actually take land for nil cost and return the value of that land at some point in the future when they've created, using the housing zone, a joint venture with a housing association, with a developer, to develop on that land, create some profit out of that, and then pay the landowner at that point. So we don't tie up capital just wasted in terms of holding on to land. And give some VAT exemptions. Perhaps look at VAT exemptions for the first 5 to 10 years of the life of housing built in housing zones. That in turn can create an additional 20% of new housing by using techniques like that have been tried and actually been successful in the past. And then incentivise joint ventures. Jack again talks about this, but getting local authorities, housing associations and developers to recognise what each of them can bring to the party and use those skills in harmony, just as we are doing together with Gateshead Council and Gallagher Try in Gateshead, building 3,000 new homes in Gateshead in what is actually the largest regeneration scheme outside of London, in Gateshead. You know, for those of you who know Gateshead will know that's not an easy gig, but we've got a joint venture there that will last 15 years over a number of sites that will deliver significant volumes in a housing market area where had previously been stalled. So a range of options, I think, to bring them together in housing so the government can actually give a means and a vehicle and a delivery to provide those new houses. So my conclusion is, I guess, the question that politicians should ask when writing the manifestos over the next 12 months is not, what can I get for X million pounds, but actually, what range of policies, planning and funding do we actually need to ensure that we get Britain building significant, large, mass volumes of housing in this country over the next 1, 2 and indeed 3 parliaments, because that is what we need in this country. It's only with that kind of approach that I think we can see housing play the key role that it can in building a safer, stronger, healthier society.
I want to start, I suppose, in a way by taking issue with the questions. So we were all the speakers, we were sent a list of questions. And I do worry a lot that in my job I get asked a lot about what's the purpose of social housing. And I wonder if I ran a professional body for agriculture or business, would I get asked, what's the purpose of business? What's the purpose of agriculture? So I'm going to stop answering that question from today, because I don't think we need, and I think we do ourselves a disservice if we continue to answer a question about what's our purpose. I know what the purpose of social housing is. You all know what the purpose of social housing is. Our job is to get on, I think, and deliver. So no more from Grainia answering that question. I do absolutely know it's not, however. I know it shouldn't and ever be a temporary form of welfare. And what I worry about is we have begun into a debate that is well progressed into how do we get people into social housing, how do we get them out of there as quickly as possible, when actually it needs to be about how do we improve people's lives in the best possible way with the right form of shelter at a time when their circumstances need it. Of course, people will move on, but we need to find much, much better ways of doing that than we do. We've come a long way from Bevan's vision of this universal form of housing, a mixed tapestry of people living in communities. I think we shouldn't move so far away from that vision. I think it's not so difficult and complicated to not have a view that we would have people having the kind of choices that they need. But the big complication, as we all know, we've heard it many times, and Mark has said it and Jack before, we haven't been building enough homes. We haven't been building enough homes for a generation. And as a consequence, of course, the cost of housing has now risen well beyond the cost or the rise in income. So there is a massive gap, and we only see that gap increasing if we don't take a fundamental step change, an absolutely fundamental step change. So some of the things I want to talk about today is not just about how we build the homes we need, but how do we actually build at the scale in which we need. Because to get to 200,000, or as Alex says, to get even beyond that to the projected scale of housing need, we need something significantly different from anything we've seen in the last 20 to 25 years. So we do need, and somebody said yesterday, I think it was Hilary Bennett, I think we need a revolution. I think we do need something very, very different from what we've had. One mistake we could make immediately as we get on the cusp of the next market cycle is to just view social housing by itself as an individual tenure, and you can make changes to it that won't have an impact elsewhere. Let's not make the same mistakes again. When you change things in one tenure, it has an impact elsewhere. And part of the reason we are struggling right now with housing, and part of the reason you've seen the growth in the private rented sector is because you've seen a reduction in models elsewhere. So one of the points of view, or one of the approaches that we'll be taking at the CIH is to continue to push a debate on a mixed housing economy, which really is about saying where are the models that we need, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from the last market cycle. But there isn't going to be a single one way to do this, and each different housing market is going to need different things. I'm speaking later on at an event run by the Northern Housing Consortium on the Northern housing crisis, or the crisis in housing in the North. And there is no single market in the North either, any more than there is a single market in London. So we are going to need a whole different type and range of products. What I'm encouraged by is over the last 3 to 4 years, providers, housing organisations working in social housing have completely answered that agenda and have responded by developing the kinds of new types of products that we need. And that has shown, I think, that it is possible over a period of time, very, very quickly, when a market turns, and as a housing organisation you need to be able to respond. To answer the question about what will happen to the affordable rent model, I think the affordable rent model was of its time. It was a response to a certain set of conditions. Those conditions are now changing. I hope they are changing. And that doesn't mean they're actually getting any better, but I think we cannot assume that housing organisations would be able to take the kind of decisions and the kind of risks to their balance sheets that they've been able to do. That is not sustainable over the long period. So we absolutely need to find other models for that. But that notion that affordable housing or the affordable rent model can continue in exactly the same way, I think we need to put past. And from our point of view, somebody said it earlier, I think it was you, Mark, you cannot get subsidised housing without subsidy. So the question has to be, what's the form of subsidy? And we forget this in debates about housing and social housing. Social housing is not the only form of subsidised housing in this country. All forms of housing are subsidised to a certain extent. So I'm a homeowner, so I benefit from tax relief on capital gains. I don't pay tax on capital gains. The government is just about to intervene in the housing market in a way it hasn't done for a very long time on Help to Buy. That's an intervention, it's a form of subsidy. And if I was a private landlord, then I would also gain from some tax reliefs as a private landlord. Now, the question for government is, how do we get those subsidies right? How do we get the balance right so that we are supporting different parts of the market? And yes, I absolutely agree that we need to return to a level of capital subsidy for social housing in order to build. There is no other way around this. When you look at building the number of homes that we need, over the past 40, 50 years, the only way in which we've done it is direct intervention. And the only way, I think, that you will see as a quick way to answer one of the questions is to give local authorities the ability to enhance their borrowing and to take advantage of really historically low borrowing costs. Borrowing's at a 130-year low. So local authorities could borrow 7 billion and build 75,000 homes over 5 years. That is possible. It's something that could be done relatively quickly, and I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't take advantage of some of those borrowing or levels of borrowing. Some final points for me, and I'm in many ways keener to get your questions. There was a question around whether we should sell off expensive social housing stock. I'm biased. I run the professional body for housing professionals. Let professionals take those decisions. Landlords, like any business, will take the right decision that's in the best interest of their own balance sheets and that's in the best interest of their own assets. Some, as Mark said, have been doing that already and they've been doing it very well. I think it's absolutely right that we should have an emerging debate on how to use your balance sheets. But there's a point that's being missed in some of this debate, which is if I was somebody on a low income living in social housing and I happen to find myself in a market that when I moved into that property 25 years ago no one else wanted to live in, and now the market has boomed and I suddenly find my landlord wants to sell that property or wants to dispose of those properties. I think there's a debate to be had about not allowing lowest income people to be damaged by the fact that markets change and they change very quickly. Landlords also have to take decisions on a 30-year asset base, not just how the market looks today or how it might look in 5 years. So I suppose my final point would be housing professionals will take long-term business decisions. They always have, they always will, and rightly so. What I need from government is all political parties taking some decisions that will be brave, that will think outside the box in terms of allowing local authorities to borrow at a time that I know it's not politically attractive, but my goodness, it's cheap, and start to inject some capital subsidies so that we're not chasing a housing market and continually seeing the housing benefit bill rise. There is no other way around this. If you want to subsidise housing, it takes subsidy. The question is, what's the right thing?
Alex is our final speaker, and he comes with a health warning. At last week's Liberal Democrat conference, he annoyed Don Foster so much that the minister threatened to strangle him. So hopefully he won't incite such strong emotions today. Thanks, Alex.
The role of a think tanker is always to be sort of slightly annoying to the minister on the panel. I always think you're not slightly annoying, not too annoying. You're not doing a job. So to put things into perspective, it's great to hear the housing debate now talks about all forms of tenure and the need for supply. Regardless of whether you support social housing or home ownership or private rented, all three are going to exist for the next few decades, and all three should exist for the next few decades. It's quite clear that we need all three. And how they interact is very interesting. So, for example, the heyday of right to buy, waiting lists actually fell from 1980 to 1997, which is the general heyday of right to buy. The waiting lists in this country fell, and they fell because people could afford to move, and less people were going on the waiting list for social housing. So that's an example of where you don't get one sector right, i.e. private house building, that then leads to huge problems where you've got 1.8 million people desperately trying to get into the social housing sector. The problem with housing is not lack of money, and this is one bit where I depart from the consensus. There is, it costs about £80,000 to build a house in this country. Houses do not cost £80,000. Normally a system where something costs less to produce than it can be sold for means that more gets built. Obviously the way that the planning system and the big developers and various other problems intercede means that that doesn't happen. So rather than, if you completely abolish the planning system, you'd solve the housing crisis. I don't think anyone suggests that really, because there are some things that the planning system does that we want to do, but the idea that the system is short of money, I think, is a bit of a red herring. You can build a house for £80,000. Houses do not cost that. What you need to do is create a structure where that demand, all that money that's currently just pushing up prices, gets pushed into building new houses. And I think that's one of the things that we've been pushing for a long time, to try and get politicians to understand that and say, look, it's not primarily about money, it's about creating a structure where instead of money being pumped in and prices going up, money is pumped in and actually more houses get built, which is what everyone in this room wants to see. One of the things around that is to do with the design of housing, whether that's council housing or private housing. So we did a report called Create Streets, and this argued that there was a mistake made in the past about high density housing, and it's a mistake that we unfortunately looks as if we may be making again. We are not against high density housing. High density housing is great in lots of areas, you need it, London for example, but there are different ways to get high density housing. So the terraced street with 4 stories and a few flats dropped in is actually incredibly high density. In fact, often it's higher density than the big 1960s slab estates that we built, because they have these weird communal areas that aren't particularly loved. They aren't parks, they aren't gardens. So there are dangers now in some of the planning guidance that we have coming through, including the London Plan, that we are pushing towards a type of development which tends to be more unpopular, i.e. slab estate, rather than going, what we need to do is look at what people want and provide high density, which is terraced housing with flats in it. And I'll give you an example of that. 80% of people who have families who are on the 4th floor and above are social tenants. So when you give people the choice in the private sector, no one wants to live, almost no one wants to live in high-rise buildings because they don't suit families. Yet we are now in danger of creating, in parts of London, some of the mistakes of the past, where we should push families which are not really a suitable group for high-density, slab estate developments towards that. So we think you have to reduce the political barriers to building more homes, and that will help get us to the 200,000 to 230,000 homes a year we need. And that means in brownfield sites we have to look at how the planning system sometimes has unintended consequences, i.e. building slab estates rather than terrace streets. The argument around this is a lack of political will. Since 1980, we have had lots of governments come in and say there is a lack of political will. And it does worry me that I think we are on the verge of repeating it. So in the 80s, the government had a system called planning by appeal, where they said if you come to us as developers, we will push through developments. That failed. We then had the councils running planning in the 90s, which failed. We then had regional spatial strategies, which were again an attempt from the centre, which failed. We then finally had the coalition, which then went back to local plans, which has failed. And now we are going back again to, we're going to push things down from the centre. And unsurprisingly, given I just repeat that sequence, I think it's going to fail. So I do think that there is a problem that is somehow seen that if we just had a bit more political will at the centre, we can shove these things through. And that's to some extent why I was interested to hear about neighbourhood plans. So I think even if you are going to shove things from the top, if you can reduce some of the political tensions at the bottom, you will have a much easier time and a smoother ride. On the question of allocations, I think it's good that we've moved to a place where we have a sensible debate. Everyone recognises that social housing is going to be distributed primarily by need, but on the other hand, you don't want to get a situation where someone who goes out to part-time work and is then sort of dropped down a little bit of the list and then feels that they are not going to be able to get a council flat or move. If they're living in overcrowded accommodation, that they've dropped some of the point off, they've dropped enough points that they will be penalised by it. So I think there is something for councils to try and be intelligent about how they apply that. On asset management, which is probably the sort of the bit where I have the biggest difference with the panel, I am more sceptical as to how large a part of the current funding is coming from asset management. So we run figures from the English Housing Survey, and it worked out that you could get about £6 billion a year. And this was applying very conservative projections, and it was just selling off empty houses. So this wasn't, for example, unlike the benefits tax, which asks people who are housing benefit claimants to move, what we were saying was when you have an empty property that you should value it, and if it is above more than the average in that region, so it's not the national average, but not sort of very local average, but the sort of regional average, then you should sell it off and use the proceeds to build more homes elsewhere. And the arguments were I appreciate there is a level of discretion, but I think that there is also a problem when you are a sector that is charitable, that is meant to be helping as many people as possible for the money that the support the government is giving you, that there are councils out there and some housing associations that do not take sensible measures. Now you can say where discretion should be applied, there may be a grey area, so you have quite a high cap and then an area of grey for discretion. But I think to be against the principle that you should have to sell off expensive properties and reinvest the money into building 3 or 4 homes, I think is wrong. I think as a minimum that there should be transparency, so that housing associations should have to publish the vacant stock as it flows through their system. I think that would probably embarrass some councils and housing associations that aren't doing good asset management into doing better asset management. And I think this isn't just a question about, oh well, this is all about fairness for taxpayers, although to some extent from our perspective it is, but it's also an issue of you have 3 or 4 people, 3 or 4 other families who are going to be living in overcrowded, unsuitable accommodation, so that one family can live in a house that's very expensive. And that's not fair. That's not what the welfare state was designed to do, either from the point of view of taxpayers or from the point of view of people who are in need. The system is there to help those people, not to give a small group of people something that's far better than the vast majority of people, including the people who commute, for example, into London, could afford. And my final bit is custom build, which I think Labour, as the coalition, are very interested in. It's how, in most other countries, over half of all housing, or around half of housing, comes from custom build, which isn't you design it, build it, and do everything yourself. People don't suddenly become some kind of superhero housing expert. But what it means in most other countries, you get a plot of land, you commission someone else to design it, you commission someone else to build it. There's often there's off-the-peg companies that sort of you go and go, I'd like that one with a bit of a twist. And I think there's an interesting question, given that I think we are going to see that sector increase, whether the housing association sector wants to get involved in that, whether or not they are people who have some expertise in the planning system, who have some expertise in development, about whether custom build is something that they can use almost as a side-on that then could subsidise other areas and subsidise their general construction of social housing. Because I think it's something that if they're going to get, if Jack's right and we're going to get to 200,000 homes by 2020, I think a fair proportion of the increase will come through an increase in custom build, just as it is in other countries.
Thank you. Well, we're now going to open the floor to questions, so we'll take 3 at a time and the panel can answer all or as many as they want. So, anyone who hasn't asked a question before? No, go for it then. Sorry, we're waiting.
Sorry, I thought you were someone behind me there.
No, yes, go for it.
Sorry. I think it can be assumed that some degree of high-rise will have to happen, and the devil's in the detail. Do any of the panel have any ideas around whether it should be limited to the number of floors, but more importantly, the RNIB, the Royal Institute, the architects in REBA, do have a formula, and it seems to be very important. The formula is that sufficient ground space should be provided around that any high-rise that makes it socially more workable than not having the ground space.
Okay. Any other questions before we take that from Helen? Yeah, on the other side.
In everything I've heard this week, I'm still not hearing about SMEs, about their involvement in delivering this process, and I'm not hearing about the supply chain and the absolute importance about buying materials that are manufactured here and driving the economy and creating that wealth and the jobs and growth that we really need. So you know, every housing strategy I've seen so far, including grants, failed to mention the supply chain. I struggle to understand how you've got anything without the supply chain in place.
Okay, one more? No. Okay, so we'll take those two questions. Mark, do you want to start?
Sure, okay. In terms of the SME involvement, I think that's a really good question. It was one of the things behind our proposal for a housing zone. Because I think one of the things you do get is if you are a developer and you're doing 30 houses here and 30 houses there, you don't get a chance to actually work within that community in the sort of creating apprenticeships, creating supply chain. It's actually very hard to do. If you can create over a long period of time a number of sites that actually tie together, then that I think actually creates the opportunity for organisations to put down some roots. So in Gateshead, for example, where we're doing that, we've got a major apprenticeship programme where we're taking on a significant number of people from that community and creating that. You can then actually have your relationship with your suppliers from that community, because you know you're going to require bathrooms on year 1, you're going to require it on year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and you can create that certainty. So I think it is about scale and mass as part of the solution to some of that. In terms of high-rise, I have to admit, I'm a fan of high-rise, but I think it has to be done correctly and appropriately. And I think this country got it so wrong, where we built high-rises in a sea of open space that suddenly became kind of almost war zones, an indefensible space for people outside. And I grew up in Dundee, or Whitfield, Scarn block development, I think was named in the top 4 worst housing estates in Europe. And it was shocking. And that was badly constructed, poor use of materials, poor use of space, and poor use of planning. However, I think when it's done right, and it has to be appropriate to the community, I think high-rise actually is part of the solution. It makes good use of land, and on a country with very little land, for a start, that has to be a good thing. But it's all in the design. It's absolutely all in the design, and for too often, when we're planning high-rise developments in this country, the planning is all about the actual construction of the building and not so much about the immediate land, and absolutely not about the community and the environment that it actually fits into as well. And if we get those 3 things together, again, I guess I'm arguing to go back to more master planning day, which is kind of a confession to make. I'm a planner. It's not often I say that in public. I'm probably the only one here, and I'm sufficiently far away from Alex. He can't actually kick me, and I'm near the door even if he wants to try. But I think a lot of this is actually about a return to the propers, what planning was invented for, in actually making the best use of space in communities going forward, not as something that controls dormer extensions and Velux windows in houses. Planning is about that level, that quality of contribution to the environment, and that is part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's definitely several lessons that we need to learn really quickly from the last housing boom, and one of them absolutely is you don't build a housing system on credit and you don't build it on speculation. And the second one is that during that, do not lose your aspirations for what a good what a good home should look like. And we definitely did. I think we lost our way in terms of how we design the properties that we live in, and not just design them for the use that we have today, but design them for the homes of the future, irrespective of what our circumstances are. I strongly support the work that REBA has done. I think it goes back to my earlier point about professionals will tend to come up with the right suggestions themselves because we've been educated to do that. And they did a very good piece of work in running a commission that came out with a vision for what good and well-designed homes could look like for the future. If I was to say one thing that worries me slightly about, and I'm absolutely, as you heard me say earlier, absolutely fully signed up to the notion that we need to build and build fast. I think what we're at risk in that debate of not also saying, as we're building the homes that we need to build, let's not take our eye off the quality and standards issue immediately, because you know we have to get that balance right. So I would be the first one to say, start building and start building now, but I'm also very clearly of the view that we have a window of opportunity to go back to REBA and say, right, you guys go first, tell us what those design standards must be, because otherwise we'll be 5 years from now going, what have we done? I suppose I think that's probably covered. What was the other issue? So high density and SMEs, yes. I think that's part of, I could be overly optimistic here, but I think that's part of the reason why the Treasury now gets why you would take housing seriously. You know, they know and understand, the government knows and understands, the fact that the supply chain is British-based means that, you know, the tax take to the Treasury is so much greater. That's partly down to the development model in the UK, and there are lots of things I love about it, and there are lots of things I don't love about it, but actually, from the point of view of just investing and keeping the money domestically, then I think that's been, that narrative, though you're absolutely right, hasn't come out that strongly in this conference. It's been really a strong argument that we've taken to Treasury in terms of making the case for housing. What's been interesting is also as the Institute of Directors and the CBI and others are now saying it too, and that's made such an impact. You know, it's all very well for housing professionals to say build more homes, and we would say that, but when the business community says it, because they see the advantage. And I think the other thing that they've done a very good job of is also making the case that if we don't have the homes we need, employers cannot find the labour force that they need. And you know, the part of the single biggest problem with the supply issue right now is we are choking off a young, active labour force. I mean, I absolutely take a point, Mark. You know, I think about graduates who are graduating, you know, just past June, and I think, how are they going to get, not just get the jobs, but get to the jobs if we don't have, a labour market and a housing market that actually talks to each other. So we've some very, very big questions ahead, and I think we need SMEs around the table actually arguing the case really strongly and saying to the housing profession, you have to bat for us and we'll bat for you.
So on the high-rise point, we're not against all high-rises, but the argument that Britain's about to run out of land is not, or England particularly is going to run out of land, is not one that we are hugely, well, it's not that we don't believe, it's just not, that's not true. About 7% of England has been built on that, includes all the gardens, all the parks, basically everything that's inside sort of a reasonably loosely defined urban area, that's 7%. So there are some areas, such as inner London and some of the other cities, where you want reasonably high density. You can achieve that by building a type of housing that is far more popular, i.e. terrace housing with flats dotted throughout. So even on the grounds that if you want to build more houses, we have to persuade people to support more housing, and building houses that people like is generally a good way to help that process along. I mean, there is a group of people who are rich and childless, who there's never been a study that shows that this group loses out. They love them. Older people sometimes like them because you basically put a concierge in, it's sort of, and there's a lift that can be maintained easily. So we're not against all of them, but for lots of people, for most people probably from the age of about 20 to about 60, unless you're rich and childless, there's quite a lot of evidence from lots of countries that most people don't like them, and quite a lot of evidence that shows, particularly for families, there are negative problems. So, for example, they were talking about the REBA, you have to build open space around that. That open space, unless it's a garden or a park, tends quite quickly to become, unless you have huge service charges, and you know, the bargain, for example, I think is £2,000. Well, unsurprisingly, if you're paying that in maintenance, you can make almost any area work. Unless you're prepared to whack huge maintenance costs onto social tenants, building that type of housing for most people is not a good way forward. So we're not against, you know, don't build any high-rise in London, because that would be, you know, bonkers, and there's a small group of people it seems to benefit. But don't, on the other hand, create rules, which is what the London Plan does, that make it very hard to build traditional terrace streets. Simply, lots of it's just down to the stairs aren't wide enough. You can't build narrowly. If you're above 4 floors, you have to have a lift. So most of West London, or large stretches, it would be illegal under the current. That's what we're arguing against. We're arguing against a system where rules that might have come in for good reason, have the unintended consequence of making it hard to build housing that people want at a density that's high. That means that we can get people close to jobs, which is what the panel have been talking about. On the SME point, I suppose one of those things, just because people don't talk about it doesn't mean that it's not important, in that you know, if we build more houses, SMEs will benefit. If we can get housing numbers to 200,000 rather than 100,000, the people who are doing the bathrooms, doing the kitchens, all the supply chains will benefit from that. I mean, we don't. It's one of those things where it's almost self-evident. You can argue that it hasn't been enough in the debate, but I think that.
I'm sorry, I think you talk about self-interest there. I'm talking about SMEs building houses.
Oh, you mean small?
And,
that,
and they can't get finance, so they're not in play because they can't get it. So.
The fact that we have an increasingly oligopolistic, sort of a small group of, almost like a cartel of developers, a lot of that has to do with the way that you can't get land, more than anything else, more than finance. When I speak to the small developers, they are mostly being squeezed out by the big developers. It's not. So how is it that the
Can
large...
I let you two debate this afterwards? It's just that I can see lots of people itching to get to Ed's speech, and we're just hitting 1:45, which is the end of this fringe. So if you want to carry the conversation on afterwards, then please do. But let's thank our speakers and then head on to the speakers.